everyone hear us? Is this on?
Yeah, oh,
yes it is. Great. So my name is Liz. I am truly honored to be joined by two amazing activists who were able to, a lot of us have become activists in the aftermath of a very controversial election, but they have tons of experience putting that activism to work and getting actual policy changes made. And so I'm really excited to learn from the both of you today, and there'll be time after, about 20 minutes, that we're reserving for Q&A because I'm sure that you all have burning questions as well. So I'm joined by Linda Sarsour, who is the co-chair of Women's March. Okay, the mic was doing something weird. The co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the Women's March, and successfully led. I don't even know how to introduce you. You have so many successful campaigns that you've been part of, and so super excited for you to be here. And Andrew Wetzler, also an amazing activism in the environmental space, and he is on the National Resources Defense Council. And so we'll be talking about women's rights and immigration and in the environment, but also everything in between, because I know that both of you are very intersectional in the way that you approach all of these things. So I guess my first question might seem obvious, but I'm curious for you what's at stake. Since the election especially, what is at stake for you? Linda, do you want to start?
I think for me, as a Muslim in this country, as a daughter of immigrants, as a progressive, as someone who cares about the environment, as someone who has been working on criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration, everything's at stake. Our immigration system is at stake, our health is at stake, and I think for many communities, including the ones I organize with, this is a matter of survival right now. This is not just bad people that we don't agree with and are on the other side of the issues. These are people who are literally taking us back to a time that we don't want to go back to. So anywhere from, and Andrew will talk more about this, anywhere from denying climate change and taking away funding to Jeff Sessions talking about taking us back to the war on drugs, anywhere from the banning of refugees in this country to the focusing on surveillance of Muslim communities. Across the gamut, deportations. We just saw a detention of dozens of Chaldeans who are Christians, who are Arab Christians, who are going to get deported back to Iraq. For someone who cares about minorities, religious minorities, I guess you don't care about those. So just a lot at stake. It's a matter of survival right now.
Right, and Andrew, in terms of the environment, it feels like there's an assault every single day. What have the last few months been like?
They've been incredibly intense, and can everybody hear me okay? I know the acoustics in this room are a little bit funky. There is, and we really shouldn't we shouldn't minimize the challenge that Linda just pointed out. There is an extremely sophisticated, well-organized, and well-thought-out attempt to roll back progress that have been made in a variety of issues. And one of the most intense places where that's happening is environmental protection. And the tragedy is not only the stakes, literally the fate of the planet lies in our hands right now, but the fact that the world, led by the United States, was really on the cusp of flipping to a clean energy future. And it still is in some ways, but the amount of innovation and change that was accelerating before the last election, and all of which is now threatened, is really astounding.
So I'm sitting here, and I'm sure many people in the audience are just kind of like, and this is how I feel every day. I feel like there are so many things to tackle. There's so many problems, and an assault of, I feel like every day we all get sort of an assault of information that is worrying, that is terrifying, and while we're trying to work on one thing, some other fire is going on somewhere else. How do you focus? And what's your advice for people who are sitting here and who want to get involved and sort of dealing with that focus issue where you feel like you're being gaslighted and you don't know where to start?
So I feel gaslighted every day, and I feel anxiety every morning, reminding myself that this is not normal. I tell myself every day that this is not normal. But this is why it's important for us to build an intersectional movement. Because when you are a person who only, or if you are like an environmental justice activist and you're only organizing in the environmental justice movement, or if you're a racial justice activist only organizing on racial justice, we actually break up the power of the movement, right? We break up the opportunities for us to support one another. There might be a day where we all got to focus with the environmental justice folks, and we got to step up for, calling somebody, rallying somewhere. There's another day where there's someone who got shot by a police officer. We need to focus there. There might be a new appointment that we have to focus on. So this coordination that we're seeing in the opposition needs to happen on our side. So I tell people all the time that we all have cell phones. And one thing that we know about people in power is that they do not like to be outed in public. They do not like to get phone calls to their offices. And we saw that the first time around the Affordable Care Act in the first phase. The people from all sides were literally doing sittings, calling up there, and it didn't move the first time around. We got to the point where Paul Ryan pulled it because he was like, this is just not going to go well for us. I got to go back and build more power and build more alliances until I take it back to the table. So I feel like we all have cell phones. We got to be calling these members of Congress and these U.S. senators. They have to know that they work for us. Like, we always see these people on television. We see them at these town halls, but we forget that it is our taxpayer dollars that pay these people to do their job. And when they're working against our interests, they need to know that. And when they're doing the right thing, we also need to tell them, thank you so much for not voting, for voting not to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Thank you for not supporting the president on defunding climate, change programs. And we have to start being engaged and active as a community. And I tell people all the time, if we can't just wait for that horrific moment to come for us to, get up. We got to do this gradually, and we got to get into the habit of holding these folks accountable.
You speak to a point that's so important, which is focusing also on who your representative is on these sort of, we can tend to see sort of the Trump presidency as like the enemy and that's the villain, but it's made up of so many different people whose survival is at stake. A lot of Republicans want to hold on to their seat over supporting Donald Trump or supporting the Paul Ryan budget or whatever policy it is. So in terms of the environment, what does that translate into? The Paris Agreement, again, feels like this big national, international story, but is there anything that people can do on the local level?
And that's a really great question, and I think it doesn't just apply to the environment, but to all these issues. While progress on the international level and on the federal level, a lot of that's defense right now, is crucial, the biggest kind of hubs and laboratories for change right now is the local and city level. And the places where we're investing in as an institution is on the community level. It's on cities, it's on state houses, and it's even below the city level, whether or not it's energy efficiency for buildings or just transit policies and park policies for people or healthy water and food. There's a huge amount of influence that local policymakers can make. And as far as individuals goes, you can really think about, in some ways you can really think about successful movements as having, there's lots of different ways to analyze it, but three kind of components. One is the kind of policy level, national, professionalized activist organizations that have lawyers and economists and scientists and lobbyists and think over a long period of time about specific policy change. That's really what we do. The second is, of course, mass movements of people who come out to the street and lend their energy, and obviously that's what you've done incredibly successfully. But then the third is small local experimentation and innovation, and a lot of people here are involved in that, both for social entrepreneurs or in small nonprofits or just in community groups. And whether it's a food bank or a community park or a small startup, that's absolutely indispensable to making change.
Right, and to your point, the march, and speaking about these large mass movements, how do you maintain the momentum of that? And what do you say to people, I'm sure you've heard about these critics who say, well, okay, women went out and now what? They're not doing anything to sort of sustain that movement.
I think the Women's March on Washington was exactly what we needed at the exact right moment. It was the day after inauguration. It was an opportunity for us to see the potential of when people do mobilize. And we brought out 3.5 million people to the streets of the United States of America in the largest single-day protest in U.S. history. That's just fact of the matter. And And it was led by women, but it wasn't just for women. And it was also led by women of color. And we were able to put forth one of the most boldest progressive platforms and intersectional platforms that we ever seen, to start shifting the way that we have been organizing as progressives. And I think one of the reasons why we've been losing and why we're in the situation that we're in is because we have been organizing in silos. And it was really important for us to have an organization like NRDC, to be one of our largest sponsors for the Women's March, because then it sends a message. It's like, wait a minute, what's an environmental justice organization doing with women? In fact, it exactly makes sense to me, right? It made sense to me that we had ACLUs and racial justice organizations and transgender rights organizations. Like, this is the kind of organizing that we need. And the momentum has been. Ever since the Women's March on Washington, March for Science, the climate march was beautiful. I actually was in the Washington, D.C. one, that people being able to mobilize both on the local and on the national level. But also the wins that we've had. I mean, we just came out of an election in New York City for a Bernie surrogate, one of the most progressive left women you can ever find. She's so left, she falls off the sides. And she won in a red Trump district out in Long Island, Christina Pellegrino. So we have examples of special elections, local elections around the country where true progressives are coming out and saying, we will not go to the center, we are going to stay on the left, and we're going to win. And they are winning. So I see the momentum of the amounts of people participating and calling their local legislators. You guys saw the literally standing room only town halls. I mean, these legislators never heard anybody calling for town halls. And if they went to a town hall, it would be average age 60 years old, the really, consistent kind of civically engaged seniors who come to these types of things. And you saw people of all backgrounds challenging members of Congress and US senators, and even on a local level, city council members and others. So the momentum is still there. But I always tell people all the time that we're a country of 340 million Americans. I don't expect 340 million Americans to be out on the streets all day long. It's always been a concerned few that have made the most change. So if we can maintain just the momentum that we have right now, I see a lot of potential, especially in 2018 during the upcoming midterms.
I want to touch on that, but there's something interesting happening. Obviously, in all of these movements, the Women's March, I think, was the most, visually and in terms of numbers, really, really significant protest in the aftermath of the election. Most people believe in climate change, and yet the policies that are, we don't even really know if Donald Trump believes in climate change. I think, who was it? Nikki Haley, I think, said on CNN, probably, that's all we know. There's a lot of things we want to know as well in addition to that. But where's that kind of energy on the environment side? Or am I just not seeing it? Do you sense a difference when it comes to the engagement?
I do, and we've seen, and I think many environmental groups have seen, just a huge surge in our membership. We have over 1.5 million members and activists. Our activists and people donating to us, and it's particularly interesting because the shift has been towards a very combative stance. So the amount of support that we're seeing for our litigation activities, for instance, is just through the roof compared to prior years, all of which I think indicates that there's a deep kind of under the surface support for clean air, clean water, and clean food. And the one thing that you can almost guarantee about the right wing, whether it's anti-environment or any other issue, is they will overreach, will empower. And that overreaching, I believe, is slowly awakening, the American public who want the right to clean water, who want the right to clean air, who want environmental justice, who want the minimum wage, who want, the incarceration crisis ended, across a whole spectrum of issues. So it is true, however, that the environmental issue in particular, particularly the way it's talked about and polled, and I think that our groups need to take some responsibility for that, doesn't, and Linda and I were talking about this before, doesn't kind of incite the same sort of deep belly passion that other issues do, and I'd love to hear kind of what you guys think about how that can be changed.
Any advice?
So me and Andrew were talking about this, and I've been giving mom lectures to the progressive movement since January, and just kind of thinking about where we kind of went wrong in the past and how we can do better, and how do you get people motivated and wanting to work on these issues, in particular on climate, just because it literally impacts every single human being in like the world, like literally. And I think it's about accessibility of language. It's about being able to speak in a language that everybody understands. And I think oftentimes in any movement that we're a part of, we're always either really theoretical, we're really intellectual, we create lexicon, like even in the feminist movement, or we're talking about like in the left, we say things like heteropatriarchy, we even say things like neoliberalism. Like, I don't really know if everybody in this country understands what neoliberalism is, right? And even in the climate justice, we use a lot of acronyms, and we talk about things in a very scientific way, and oftentimes it's just a few people that understand, and maybe some outside of the circle that are still a little intellectual. But being able to go to the grassroots, and I was telling Andrew, and I tell this to people, if my Palestinian immigrant mother doesn't know what you're talking about, who lives in New York, like, we're doing it wrong. And I think one of the reasons why our opposition sometimes gets a little farther ahead is that they're really simple. Make America great. They're taking your jobs, and I think if we're able to take something like climate and really get to the grassroots and show people how it really impacts them on an individual, on a family level, on a neighborhood level, and use very accessible language, I think we could get more people on board.
Right. And that simplicity is so interesting, and I think they've, it's not them versus us, but I think conservatives have done a good job, or an interesting job, of like minimizing in a simple way the things and the very important battles that you are fighting for. The one that I recently saw concerning the environment was like Tommy Lahren basically saying, there's terrorism in the world and they're fighting for the weather, like minimizing it to the weather. As if the survival of the planet, like that would just, like, we're not talking about the weather. It's actually, so much more than that. And so what do you say to that?
Which is, I have to say, incredibly ironic, because there's a reason that the United States Department of Defense, the US military, considers climate change to be a global security threat. And it's because the areas of the world that are going to be hit hardest are often the poorest areas of the world. It will cause, and is causing, drought, severe weather, mass displacement of people, mass migration, and that leads to security issues. And in fact, some of the conflict in Syria, people have theorized, is partially linked to drought and climate stress in that region.
How so?
Because when people are stressed for resources, they tend to fight with each other about them. So I think the trick is, though, that talking about climate in a way that doesn't make people feel helpless, and like there's nothing they can do. I mean, I could give a very scary talk about all the really horrible things that might happen unless we act very quickly. It's the solution piece, which I think that we've got to get better at talking about. And I totally agree on the intersectional piece. It's why NRDC just endorsed, and we've never done anything like this, the national minimum wage, $15 an hour bill, which was just introduced. And that's a real change for us as an institution. And so I think the theories of changes for all of these organizations are really coming together in a way that's interesting.
And this, comes back to the idea of, how do we speak to the other side? I think there's something really unique about Donald Trump, where I don't think he's interested in talking to people who don't agree with him, and is ready to fire some of them, allegedly, for doing so. And so I think it really is, from my standpoint, has created, we know we live in two bubbles and all that stuff, but it seems like that sort of environment and atmosphere is getting worse. How do you both handle that in terms of conversations that you've been having with people on the other side? And how are you successful in doing that?
I was actually talking to Andrew earlier about this. I think that we make assumptions about people on the other side, who they are and who voted for Trump. I think there's definitely a part of this country that I don't want to talk to, and I don't think we should be focusing on. I think there are a very small minority of people who are like diehard climate deniers, diehard racist Islamophobes, homophobes. Like, I actually don't think those people are a lot of people. I think the people that are a lot of people are two categories. They are the complacent, who are actually, generally speaking, on our side. They're just not active and they're not participating, but actually agree with us, and will sit and be like, yeah, sure, everything you say is cool, like, I got that, except they're not helping us by whether it's like holding their elected officials accountable, even going to the polls or mobilizing or showing up. The other group of people are people who I think just no one has ever came to them and asked them what they cared about. And I was telling Andrew that I was a Bernie surrogate up until we didn't make the primaries. And then of course I'm not an idiot, so I'm not naive, and I knew what side I needed to work on. And I was actually organizing in Ohio. And I went to a really rural part of Ohio, and I was having conversations with people, predominantly white working class. And when you ask people things that they care about or like what their aspirations were, they were like, oh, I want my child to go to college. I want to pay off my mortgage. I've been paying mortgage for the past 23 years. I just want this over with, I want to, people literally have the same aspiration that you have, but no one takes the time to have those conversations. And I say to people all the time that oftentimes people who you think don't like you or are not on your side, it's because they never met anyone like you. They never had a conversation, for example, with a Muslim, right? They have some preconceived notions, but the minute they actually find a human being and actually have a conversation with them, and you're able to say, yeah, man, you want to pay your mortgage, I just want to be able to afford something in New York City. I also have kids, I want to be able to send my kids to a great school. I'm probably not going to be able to do that. And people are like, wow, like we're actually more the same than we are. And I think we don't take the time to have those conversations. But again, like there's a certain group of people, like the Tommies, like not a friend of mine, not the kind of people I'm trying to convince, right? But there are other people who we may perceive to be on that side that I think are more on our side, and it just taking down our walls of judgment and assumption to have those conversations.
And how do you do that? You just ask them what they care about? What's the first sentence? Like, what's the first thing you should
I always
say?
ask people things like, like sometimes I'll be like at the bank, or like I'll be at the airport on a coffee line, literally, and I'll just be like, hey, where are you from? Where are you flying to? And people like usually get caught off guard, and they're like, oh, I'm going to Minneapolis. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. So you're not from around here? How is Minneapolis? And you get into just a normal conversation with people. I think we are so, and I watch this all the time, like when I'm in an airport or an Amtrak or something. People are always on their phones. Like you literally don't look at anybody. Nobody looks at anybody. I go up to random people and I'm just like, oh, where are you off to today? Whatever. And 98% of the time, people actually answer me and they have a conversation with me, and then I end up, walking away and feeling like, wow, I just have a new relationship with somebody, or someone's gonna go back and be like, wow, I just talked to this weird progressive Muslim lady at the train, and they probably would have saw me and not thought any of the things that I thought were actually my own views, and now they had a conversation and learned more about me. I think we just need to take more time to have those individual conversations.
Right. And yeah, beyond the sort of, personal level or being able to, make a connection that way, is there a way to talk about the environment in a way that makes sense to people who may not be warm to that idea?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think for all these issues, you need to talk at the most basic level about what people care about. And if you think about what most people care about, they care about what kind of job they have. They care about their health care usually. Do they have it? Like, where's their doctor gonna come from? They care about their kids' education, and they care about the food they eat and the water they drink. And 3 of those 4 issues, at least, are fundamentally environmental issues today. Whether we're talking about renewable energy and the promise of clean, high-paying local jobs that cannot be outsourced because the resources are here, or you're talking about the fact that literally almost none of the tap water in the United States is well regulated, and it all contains pesticides and contaminants. I'm not saying it's unsafe, but I'm saying that you can talk to people, particularly when you move to rural. And the ironic part is, if you go to rural areas of the country or red districts, it's even more so the case. The water there is much more likely to be contaminated by pesticide runoff. They have far less sophisticated water treatment plants than it is in urban areas, although it has to be noted that in places like Flint and in poor neighborhoods, there's tremendous problems with lead contamination. And then if you talk to people about their health and their health care, that also is fundamentally an environmental issue. And so I agree with Linda that we really need to get back to the super basic level of speaking. I think that the trick is, how is that energy and that activism then translated into specific policy choices? Because getting people outraged that there's going to be arsenic in their drinking water, or that somebody they know may be deported, is in some ways the easy part. And then the hard part is, how do you get consensus about a specific, boring, incremental policy change that'll make that a little bit better?
And what did we learn from 2016? What's the biggest thing? And you were talking about, there are things that progressives should have done better. What are those things that we need to change coming into 2018 or the midterms?
This is not a very popular view, but I think one of the things I learned about 2016 is that we really have to work outside of the two-party system, that the building of power is not necessarily just in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. And that doesn't mean to say that I'm talking about Green Party. I'm talking about just building really localized power. I learned in the 2016 elections is that we wake up every 4 years and everyone's like, yeah, there's an election. Let's go, everybody. Let's pick a side. Everybody pick pick the person in the race for them, whatever, the horse in the race. And it taught me that the most important part of politics is local politics. And I'm talking as low as, I'm talking about like the library council, the school board, the city council, where they too have a lot of power, even on things like climate and what kinds of resources that they're allocating on the state levels, and understanding that right now, as we think about survival under this administration, that survival is going to be at the state level, because we're not going to be able to control a Republican House and a Republican White House, but we could control our states. And I think I realize that where I want to build power is for local races, in local communities, in local neighborhoods, and not wake up every 4 years. And every 4 years becomes the accumulation of the power that we have built over the 4 years.
Do you think Republicans are better at these local races and focusing on local races?
I don't think that they're necessarily better. I think that we do a lot more public outfighting in front of everybody than they do. I think that they have figured out a way to have differences. And I'm pretty sure that even within the White House administration, there are a lot of people who disagree. But if we watched us on the progressive left, the minute one organization doesn't agree with another organization, or when one organization's position is not all the way to the left, or maybe it's two to the left, we just go outside in the media, in public, on social media, and we trash each other. And what it does is it makes people more complacent. Our people that are supposed to be on our side are like, look, I want nothing to do with that. If that's how we're going to act over here on this side, I don't want anything to do with that. So I think that the other side is a little bit more unified, at least in public, than they are. And because of their simplistic ways that they look at things, they don't have nuance, they don't have intellectual conversations the same way that we do on the left, that they can agree faster than we can on many issues.
Right. My friend Samita called it the woke police. Like
exactly
online, that basically, you're not a good progressive, or you're not a good feminist, exactly. And I think it makes people afraid to speak up and to take action because they're afraid to do something wrong.
Yes.
And yeah, it's sort of a cannibalistic sort of response. So I have one question left, and then we're going to open it up to the hot floor. I can see you guys waving your papers. It's basically like, what can people do today when it comes to the environment? Andrew, do you want to start?
Yes. Today, this week, in fact, the Secretary of the Interior is going to release a recommendation to the White House calling on a reevaluation, but what it basically means is a shrinkage down to nothing of a national monument in Utah called the Bears Ear National Monument. This is a sacred place to the native tribes in the region. It was actually an effort to create that monument under President Obama that was led by the tribes, and it's an incredibly beautiful and stunning place. And one thing that everybody can do today on their cell phone right now is to just Google Bears Ear National Monument, and I guarantee one of the top 3 results will be a take action site from NRDC or the Wilderness Society or the Sierra Club or Earth Justice or some other organization that'll ask you to write into the Department of the Interior or to write into the president or to write to your congressman and tell them that you don't support rolling back that national monument. That's a small example, but as you opened up saying, every day there's an action like this people can take, and it really does make a difference. Obviously, calling is better than emailing. Emailing is better than signing a petition. Showing up is the best of all. Getting involved in local organizations, but you can really take an action every day, and you can make it a discipline. I know people who will take an action every day, every morning when they get up, or every evening before they go to sleep.
You will not be here tomorrow to tell everyone what they should do tomorrow. Where can they sign up for information, or what's the way to sort of be able to sustainably know what the action is every day?
I will accept that softball and say it is www.nrdc.org.
Awesome. Linda, would you like everyone in this room to do today?
Same, womensmarch.com. Today we're asking folks to call Republican senators around the country around the Affordable Care Act to protect the Affordable Care Act. So we literally have actions similarly mostly every day, unfortunately. So womensmarch.com, and you'll get updates from us as well. Follow us on social media. We also put out a lot of information. One of the most important things I think I've also learned is fake news is people who post articles that they don't read, they just read headlines, and really being informed. And there's a lot of misinformation out on the internet, and the most important thing, I think the most important way to protect ourselves is to ensure that we're having the correct information, which means very simple things. If you're reading something in one media outlet and it's not anywhere else, I would be suspicious of the accuracy of that. If you're also quoting Daily Caller, Allgemeiner, or Breitbart, I would also cautious that that's probably some sort of biased information. So being able to be as well informed as possible as we watch what this administration is putting out.
Vox.com, I've heard, is great. If you want to follow, I mean, I think you're bringing up a really important point, which is, how do we find our information? And yeah, if it's a, journalistic entity like Vox.com, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, not just, more left-leaning places, just, those places fact check and can be trusted, and you should support those organizations because they are working really hard right now, as everyone on this stage is, and I'm sure many people in this room are as well. So we are going to be opening it up. I think there are some mics that are going to be disseminated around the room. If you want to raise up your hand. We have someone right there. Great.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah, it's on. My question is for Linda. You mentioned intersectionality and the importance of working with other groups who maybe don't have the exact same goals but have similar goals. And I'm just wondering how you justify that, given some of your statements in the past, which I find discriminatory against me as both a feminist and a Zionist, someone who believes in the right of the State of Israel and the right of the Jews to a home in their homeland, which isn't mutually exclusive. Also, a Palestinian state can be there. I'm just wondering how you justify that, given you stated that Zionism and feminism are incompatible, especially given your statements on intersectionality.
That's great. So back to my original comment that I made about reading beyond the headlines. So there was a Nation article, which is a very left-leaning media outlet, that wrote a piece using all of my words. Beyond the headline, everything I said was me. And the headline was, is Zionism compatible with feminism? Linda Sarsour says no. So what I would hope people would do is actually read the Nation piece in its entirety and judge me by my words and not by the headline that an editor used for clickbait, because that's what an editor wants. An editor wants you to read that piece, except most people didn't read it and based their positions on the headline. But what I will say, and what I said in that, this is very important, that if we're going to talk about, if you're going to come to the question was about the movement spaces that we're creating. And this movement space that we have created is very intersectional. Includes people who care about the plight of people all over the world, including in places like Palestine. So there's a lot of young progressive Jews, young Palestinians, African Americans, who align policing and the way it happens here in the United States and what happens in Palestine. So if you are someone who says you're a Zionist, what I said was, if you can be a Zionist and also a critic of the State of Israel, which is engaging in a brutal occupation of Palestinians, and you believe in the self-determination and the human rights of Palestinians, then you are more than welcome to come to the movement, right? The movement is open to everyone, but it's also not the movement's job, right, to create a space for a group of people so they can be comfortable by us not saying the things we want to say, like justice for Palestinians or Palestinians deserve human rights. And that's actually something that wasn't even at the Women's March, we didn't even talk about foreign policy issues at the Women's March. But I think it's important to judge people by their track record, by their work. In fact, recently, over 137 Jewish leaders across the country, mostly from the center, believe it or not, signed a letter in my support, knowing me and my work for 20 years working on human rights and justice for all people. And I, as a Palestinian, have every right and obligation to fight for Palestinians and for my family who lives in Palestine. And I hope that I get that respect and that space, and that my presence is not what makes somebody feel uncomfortable, which is really what the debate was about. That I, as a Palestinian woman who is a very visible leader in the progressive left, that was new to people, and people didn't know how to act. So if you believe in rights for Palestinians, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, if you believe that climate change is real and that we must prioritize climate justice, if you believe in women's rights, if you believe in reproductive rights, then you are welcome to this table that we are organizing on.
Next question. We have someone at the front.
Is this on? There we go. So I'm just wondering about, it's kind of speaking to a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of messaging and following through and simplifying the message. And so my question is twofold, really. So there's an issue sometimes, I worked with refugees from Burma previously, and even when the data is saying a simple story and giving a simple message, sometimes it's hard to convey that message. And the second part of that is, how do you craft a simple message for a diverse audience?
Great question. Who wants to take it first?
I'll start. So the most impactful messaging usually comes from the most directly impacted, right? When people see a refugee, a Syrian refugee who could tell you a story, and this is a real story, of a woman who can say that my husband was chopped up in a bag and delivered to my house, and I had to flee with my children, and I was on a body of water for 8 hours. I think those types of stories are quite compelling and really move people who may be the ones saying, I don't know about those refugees. And I think that's the part where we sometimes miss. We are not centering the most directly impacted people. Having a scientist tell me about the problem in Flint is not the same, doesn't have the same impact that when I went to Flint myself and actually went to a home and somebody opened a faucet for me and said to me, just so please go back to where you came from and tell them what you saw. Literally a faucet that opens and brown water is coming out of a faucet and there are kids running around in an apartment. So I think number one, directly impacted people and letting them tell their stories is the most impactful. Also, who are the messengers other than the directly impacted people? Oftentimes, I as a Muslim might have to convince someone that Islam is a religion and that I should have the right to practice my religion freely, so as long as the way I practice is not imposing on anyone. But I'm not always the best messenger, if you haven't noticed. But someone who's a friend of mine, who may be, a white woman, or maybe someone who's a Jewish woman, or someone who maybe is an atheist, who's a friend of mine, could actually get a lot farther in a conversation by saying, wait a minute, look, I got a lot of Muslim friends. This is what I think. This is what, that message might go a lot farther. And I think it's one of the reasons why we are in the situation that we're in now, because in the movement that I'm a part of, there's a lot of folks. It's diverse, people from everywhere. But people in the movement have told me, Linda, my grandmother voted for Trump. So I said, wait a minute, you are in this movement with me and we're out here working on these progressive issues and we're trying to convince people that we're on the right side, but you couldn't even convince your grandmother that she was not on the right side. So I think the most important thing for us is to figure out how whatever messaging we're using actually goes with our own families, and if your grandma's not feeling it, we might want to tweak that a little bit. So directly impacted people, and then us on an individual level. Like in my household, before I leave to convince my parent, to convince anybody else, the question is, are my parents convinced? And once I can convince my parents, I do a lot better on the outside world.
Add to that, I think that, and Liz, you probably know this better than all of us. One of the curses, but also one of the opportunities about modern media is there is no one message, and it's incredibly, it's amazing how individualized you can target particular messages to people by their buying habits, by where they live, by what they read. And so messages can be tailored to the audience. Not only is the messenger really important, but what you say can be different from group A to group B to group C. When it comes to big messages, I think that we're more in an era of tags than we are messages. I mean, if you look at the most effective messages, at least here in the United States, you're talking about Black Lives Matter, 99%, Make America Great Again, loves Trump's hate. Those are, for better or worse, like the level at which I think big national messages work. And beyond that, it has to be very specific towards audience.
Yeah, I think, if I can just add something, there's really interesting data about how we receive information and how we receive facts. And to your point, it's not just, here's a story and they don't want to read it because it's the New York Times or they perceive it to be sort of a biased outlet. There's really interesting data that shows that we don't absorb facts that we don't agree with. So if we see something that we don't agree with, we're not as likely to believe it, but also retain it. And so I think it's important to remember who we're talking to when we do have important messages. I was struck by, your comment about climate and describing it as a global security threat. I feel like that would speak to a Republican way more than, the Earth is gonna get 2 degrees warmer, which is also true. Is it 2 degrees? It's 2.
Well,
yeah. Which is,
if we're lucky.
If we're lucky,
1.5
right.
or 2 degrees.
But I think, right, like the values, and this, I'm obviously generalizing, but Republicans do value this sort of law and order and this security as an issue way more, I think, readily than the language that we're using when we talk about the environment. And they perceive it as this like wish-washy thing that doesn't really matter. So I think it's important to think about the messenger, but also who we're messaging to.
I can just add one more thing before the next question, because I'd love to hear the audience's thoughts about this and yours. One of the messages we find that works the best isn't so much the kind of utilitarian messages, it's actually moral messaging. It's like you have an obligation to future generations to care about the planet, and I'm just wondering if in other sectors if people have found out in the audience that works.
Absolutely.
Linda and Andrew, thank you so much. I will fan for another hour to hear what you have to say. But my question is a little bit directed to you personally. How do you deal with the negativity that you get in both of your professions, whether it's trying to convince people of climate change or mobilizing an entire nation? Negativity in terms of people, organizations, and news, how do you deal with it personally and also for your organizations?
So that's the story of my life. What's really interesting is that I've always gotten attacked and challenged for my ideas for a long time, for 20 years, but of course in the age of social media, it's obviously a lot more prevalent. But ever since the Women's March on Washington, those who want to challenge our ideas, because there's a difference between attacking and challenging, right? You don't have to agree with us on our issues, but I think there's a kind of a line that has to be drawn. I mean, I have been at the crosshairs of death threats, of vicious online abuse in really horrific ways. I mean, everything's public. I have had I'm gonna call them the celebrities of the opposition. I'm talking about Milo came out of retirement after the pedophilia and led a rally against me in New York City and the things that I represent. So what's scary about this right now is that it may have happened in the past, but now people feel that they can be in disagreement with you, and then they have an administration that they feel reinforces their ideas and actually puts them in the right. So we have had, as you know, armed militias come and stand in front of mosques across this country. This past Saturday, there were the 30 rallies across the country, march against Sharia. They literally, if they saw Sharia and tripped over it in the street, they wouldn't know what it was. But it really is a very scary time. And what I want people to be awake about is not just these really bad things that are happening, the rolling back of voter rights, climate justice, taking away our health insurance. I mean, all these really bad things. I'm actually even more worried than all those things in the interim about another horrific moment of, Japanese internment for Muslims. I mean, right after the London attacks that recently happened, national television commentators talking about the solution was an internment of Muslims. So the question for us and for me is, you can challenge us and our ideas. You can say that you don't agree with Muslims. You don't have to like our religion. But to create hysteria and fear-mongering against an entire group of people, which is what happened to the Japanese. It was years of propaganda against the Japanese. They were not loyal. The Japanese were not to be trusted. They would turn on you at any moment. They were a national security threat. And for years, there was a buildup to Japanese internment, and I'm pretty sure there was a room just of people like you that were probably like, this is really outrageous, Liz. Like, why is this happening? I don't agree with this. But it wasn't enough, and it happened. And Japanese Americans and their children, I know people who were born in the camps on this US soil. So my question to us here in the face of negativity is, what is our response to that negativity? What is our public response to saying that we will not be divided? We will not be gullible to the misinformation that is being pushed out by this very well-oiled right-wing machine that is constantly putting out information about certain groups of people, and being able to say, I'm gonna go talk to some Muslims. I'm going to go find some trans folks. I'm going to go find some folks that are these almost one group, like it's almost like a caricature of these communities, but I don't actually know someone on an individual level. And I tell people all the time, if there were to be a moment of an internment in this country, the way that I'm going to protect myself is by knowing my neighbors, in hopes that those neighbors that I built those relationships with are going to come to my defense and to the defense of my children and my parents, which I believe did not happen for Japanese Americans. So the negativity requires us to actually not just see it as negativity, but actually to think about what our response is. Do we intervene when our family members are posting racist articles about Muslims? Do we intervene when people are posting racist articles about a young black man who was shot unarmed by a police officer? Do we jump in and say, I disagree with you and this is why, and try to kind of disrupt the negativity and the misinformation that's happening? I think that is all of our responsibility.
Thank you, all the panelists. It's really inspiring, and I'm gratified to be able to share this afternoon with you. I'm from Search for Common Ground, and we work across dividing lines around the world. And we've noticed that, humiliation, or the sense that someone has lost their dignity, is one of the real reasons why people will radicalize or even choose violence. And there's something that I hear underneath this conversation, which is, how is it that we can enable people to be okay with changing their mind? You said something about the need for conversations, and you just reinforced it again about having that relationship with your neighbors. And yet many of the tactics, and again, I say this with all respect, about the mobilization of people against some of the agendas of the government and their supporters, is really actually humiliating. And it can create a sense of promoting a hatred or a demonization, even the way that satire is used in a very one-sided way to demonize another side. So in some ways, it's like, I feel like we're doing two things. One is we're recognizing that it's those conversations that get people to see you in your multiple identities and empathize with you that will enable them to save face and change their mind. And at the other hand, we're asking people to come out and support some of the very aggressive and adversarial tactics that make it even less possible for others to change their mind.
One last question? Actual question?
You want one more question?
Yeah, one more question. A quick one.
Hey, Linda and Andrew, a lot of the conversation has been a lot around different issues and kind of the battle over those issues. I was wondering if you could help paint a picture for us. If, in a perfect theoretical world, if you snapped your fingers and you kind of got everything you wanted, what are the primary kind of policy changes that are happening? What are the issues that you would consider really big wins?
So if I could snap my fingers right now, I think some of my top priority issues would be comprehensive immigration reform. Our immigration reform system is broken, and I think fixing our immigration system would be perfect. The second one would be ending mass incarceration, a policy that stops putting profits in prisons, that we start diverting our resources, especially for low-level offenders, and putting them back into rehabilitation programs and services, which I'm afraid looks like we're going to go the opposite direction. I think the third area for me, and I think these for me would be all on the same level. I think a triple investment in programs and science and research around environmental justice and climate, and then specifically looking at target areas in the country like Newark, New Jersey, New Orleans, Flint, because I think there are also going to be more natural disasters that are going to happen as well, and I think we need to be focused on those larger three areas. I mean, it also depends on who you ask, but those are like the top issues that I see as a need, and those that are, climate directly impacting people, asthma and health, they're like so connected. And of course, maintaining I think single-payer healthcare would be the solution to the Affordable Care Act for those that don't like the Affordable Care Act in the way that it is. I think single-payer healthcare. But I will just end by just saying this really quickly to the statement that was made that I think is connected to this, is that why was the Women's March on Washington successful? Because it was about what you stood for and why people came out with that. Our Women's March was not about Donald Trump. Of course, people might have made the connection because it was the first day after the inauguration, but the idea here was going to people and saying, what are the issues that you stand for? So if you went to our website or actually looked at our platform, it was about the things that we stood for. But I think, to your point, making those policies very clear, because we could change sentiment and change people's minds, which is cool, but if we don't actually change the laws, then we're going to be in the situation that we're in for many years post-Trump. So that's the important question, and the focus is on policy and laws.
I'll just confine my answer to the environmental space, but say, if we want, and I mean this quite literally, if we want to preserve civilization in any sort of a recognizable form that we have it now, we need to rapidly transition to 100% fossil fuel-free economy. We need to reform our food system so that we're not literally poisoning the earth, and we need to recognize globally the fundamental right to clean air and clean water. And unless we do those things, our grandchildren will not live in a world that we would recognize.
Thank you so much, Linda and Andrew. And thank you everyone for coming. You now are armed with the tools to go change the world. Now go out and do it, and go have fun for the rest of the conference. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.